Sure, there's only one bit of news globally at the moment. So I think we're going to have to pick into it and see what President Donald Trump has got to say for himself, mostly within his big statement of executive orders. And we'll see what impact this has on the world of defence. What do you think?
I think we've got no choice, have we really? I mean, it's I can't remember a series of orders like this coming out before, well over 100. And actually, whatever we think of American politics, it is going to affect our lives. So, yeah, I think we've got to dig into it, even if it dominates the podcast this week.
Yeah. Well, lots, if you pick into it, which we've done, lots actually do affect defence in one way or another. So why don't we go through them bit by bit?
Shoot.
So the first one is, how is Trump going to grow the defence base, the military power of the US? There's a few things he said specifically. You'll sort of pick into it and see how much it actually says about his intention. The first, he's used this word, reactivate the defence system in the US. What does that mean? Secondly, around 8,000 military personnel were fired because they didn't want to take the COVID vaccine. He's said they're all going to be rehired, so they'll be now serving again where they haven't been, and they're going to get back pay as well, which is nice. He's also instituted, so they can find out generally what's going on, a complete hiring freeze across the entire federal space, except for defence. In the round, what's that telling us about his attitude to defence at the moment?
Yeah, it's he's clearly holds defence with a slightly sort of unique position. So I think particularly about stopping rehiring, he's gone, we can't affect America's ability to defend itself. I think that's really, really important. I think picking out the terms, though, and there's been some misunderstanding in some of the media about this. When you talked about activating the military, I don't see any evidence that he's talking about expanding the role of the military or the like. What he has done is some of his initiatives have talked about declaring a national emergency. We'll talk a bit about that, I'm sure, later. But in terms of the borders, and that means by simply making that statement, it gives the president the power to activate the military to react to a national emergency. And I suspect, we haven't got time to get into it, but the president doesn't actually have access to huge volumes of money. That's for the government to decide. What he can do is he can put out these executive orders, and by declaring a national emergency, that opens up the taps for using the military. And I think that's what's happening in the South. The COVID one is really fascinating because I know firsthand, every time we went on operations, the military, as a duty of care, had to fill you full of vaccines. Also, I had an anthrax vaccine at one stage, which did worry me, but reassured everything was fine, because the military is putting you into harm's way, and therefore it has a duty of care to make sure that you have the best possible protection. Now, COVID, as we are well aware, was somewhat emotive about vaccines, and in parts of America they are treated with a degree of skepticism, despite the sort of the evidence, scientific evidence about them. So this is a really interesting one because it sets the tone that almost military personnel have the option of not having vaccines. And the danger of that is, if they fall ill when on operations, they place a very heavy burden on the military support system, which is something that therefore degrades operational capability. So I think that's the most interesting one of these, that I think directly might have interesting implications much wider than simply America.
Yeah, that's good. Well, I mean, I think the COVID one is I think the reason he's a bit peed off is we were told directly by Biden and Fauci that if you got the injection, you would not get COVID. And secondly, if you get the injection, you will not pass it on. How you do that if you haven't caught it, I'm not entirely sure. Both those things turned out to be just not true at all. And I think, therefore, the justification is, well, it was unfair to expect you to participate in something which was based on a falsehood. So,
and again, I do think this is an interesting one, because we could. It's a topic of debate, maybe even for your, this is you. I do think the whole issue of vaccines, particularly in America, because there's been a large body of opinion that says they're of no value whatsoever. Why are we doing it? And I think, therefore, notwithstanding what people did or did not say, vaccines sometimes have side effects, and therefore, quite rightly, it should be an individual choice. The problem is, where does that hit a military organization that says, actually, from a statistical perspective, it does provide a degree of protection. That's what the scientists say. It doesn't mean you're not going to get it. It doesn't mean you're not going to pass it on, but hopefully the effects will be mitigated, and therefore you're more likely to be able to remain operationally effective. And as a commander, when I was operating in, harm's way, you do have a duty of care to your people to make sure that they are properly protected, particularly, as I use the example of anthrax. I mean, nobody wants to get anywhere near anthrax, but there was a risk that we might get exposed to that, and therefore much better to have the vaccine than not. But it is interesting about individual rights versus collective responsibility. And I think, Trump's made pretty clear, I don't know whether this one's to do with his view about the military or whether this is a wider statement of his view of vaccines. That'll be interesting to tell.